through the G20, Sustainable Landscape Management Strategies in Agriculture. Now, this side event is part of our Task Force 4 on Food Security and Sustainable Agriculture. This webinar is hosted by the Center for Indonesian Policy Studies, or CIPS, in cooperation with the World Resources Institute, or WRI Indonesia. My name is Aditya Alta. I'm the head of Agriculture Policy Research at the Center for Indonesian Policy Studies. And I will be your moderator for today's discussion. To open our discussion today, we already have with us Ibu Dr. Damayanti Bukhari, who is our lead co-chair of the T20 Task Force 4 on Food Security and Sustainable Agriculture. And I would like to give the floor to Ibu Dr. Dami to deliver an opening remark. Ibu Dami, the floor is now yours.
Okay, thank you, Aditya. Good afternoon, good morning to everyone who is joining this session today. I would like to welcome Pak Main and also Pak Andika. Thank you so much for coming and becoming our speaker for this side event. As we all know, well, this G20 is now, with what is happening in the world, people are now asking, is G20 still going to go on? Well, whatever the case may be, we in the T20, we have our mission, and our mission is to deliver the communique and also the policy brief by September 2022. So in order to do that, we have 10 policy areas, and we have conducted a series of discussion to also help the authors and also help ourselves in understanding more about food security and sustainable agriculture. So with that, it is with a great pleasure to see my old friend, Professor Maine, and also my dear friend, Andika, to be the speaker for today on sustainable landscape management. As we all know, food system, landscape, sustainable landscape is something that is very intertwined. We tend to avoid thinking about complexity because we want to be more simple, more linear. So I think today's discussion about sustainable landscape, it will really enhance our understanding what is needed to achieve sustainable agriculture. So once again, I would like to thank you to both speakers, and really looking forward to learning from you today how sustainable landscape management is linked with food security and also sustainable agriculture. Thank you. Thank you, Aditya.
Thank you, Budami, for highlighting the unique challenges and expectations of this year's G20 and the complexity of land use, which is exactly what we're going to talk about today as we try to unravel the complexity of the land-based sector, with oftentimes conflicting uses for forestry, biodiversity conservation, and of course for food production. Again, so what is this concept or approach about sustainable landscape management? What are the necessary components for it and for policies to adopt an integrated approach to land use? And perhaps how can global leaders convening for the G20 help promote a sustainable landscape management? Now, to address these questions and perhaps more, today we are joined by our two wonderful experts working in agroforestry and food security research to help us discuss this matter further. We are honored to have with us Bapak Andika Putraditama, Deputy Program Director of Agriculture, Forest and Land Use, World Resources Institute, and Dr. Meine van Noordwijk, Distinguished Senior Fellow at Center for Indonesian Forestry Research, or C4, and the World Agroforestry, ICRAF. Each of our experts here will have approximately 10 minutes to present their ideas. And afterwards, we will open the floor for discussion with our participants. I would like also here to invite our audience to post your questions in the chat box, which you can do so at any point during the discussion, so you don't have to wait until the Q&A session. And we will raise them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I'm inviting our first speaker, Pak Andika Putraditama, to start our discussion with the first presentation. Pak Andika, the screen is yours. You are still on mute, Pak.
Oh, there you go. Okay, now I can unmute myself. I think now I'm co-hosting this as well. Thank you, Mas Alta, Ibu Dami. It's a really great opportunity to be here with Prof. Maine as well. And again, G20 agenda is very important for Indonesia, and this is a very good forum that we can also share our thoughts on this. This is a very important topic, of course. Let me first share my screen, and I hope this is going to be brief, under 10 minutes. I have my stopwatch beside me, but of course, talking about this very large and a wide spectrum of issue, we wouldn't be able to cover everything in 10 minutes. So hopefully we can discuss more in the discussion session. So I'm going to start with this a very, I think, nice graphic in summarizing the spectrums of landscape intervention. And I think this is very relevant for Indonesia, but as well as for other G20 members countries. At least for Indonesia, we have all of the spectrums of intervention in this graphic. The first thing is we still have a lot of intact forests. We still have a lot of forest left in our country, whether it's fragmented as well as degraded forests. And one of the key priority here is to safeguard the intact forest and the fragmented forest, as well as the degraded forest, from being lost to conversion, as well as being, illegally encroached and heavily degraded. And the second priority is to maintain the existing forests through sound stewardship and being able to be keeping the forest in a sustainable manner for a very long time. And the third intervention would be to restore the productivity, connectivity, as well as the function of the forest in a sustainable manner as well. And I'll go through each of this, I think, menu of intervention in more details in a couple more slides. On the safeguarding of our forests, I quoted some statistics from the Ministry of Environment and Forestry. This is coming from their latest statistic in 2020 that looks into existing forest cover based on their legal status. So based on the Kaya Haka statistic, we have around 7.1 million hectares of forest in non-forest state, meaning that the 7.1 million hectares of forest is likely to be converted into non-forest usage. On the other side, we still have a good number, 88.4 million hectares of forest within the forest estate that should be utilized for forestry uses. And then, and this is the interesting one, we have 31.8 million hectares of non-forest cover in forest estate, which means this can be used for agriculture purposes, this can be used for infrastructure, but it could also be restored into forest function as well. But looking into this very simple statistic, I think we can come up with a summary of intervention that we can propose to optimize our land use and landscape management. So for the 7.1 million hectares of forest in non-forest estate, you would need to, advocate for a better ethical supply chain policy, no deforestation policy for agriculture production, as well as moratorium policy for forests to be converted into other land uses, which our country has. because this 7.1 million hectares of forest is located in a non-forest estate, which has less protection within our legal framework. The second is for the 88.4 million hectares of forest within the forest estate, there are a number of interventions that can be implemented. We have, of course, limited impact logging system, sustainable forest management. There's also an option to do yield improvement, but more importantly is also looking into legacy issues and license review of existing forest concessions. If you look into the eastern part of Indonesia, Papua and West Papua, one forestry concession in Papua and Tanah Papua, it could be in the size of 60,000 hectares. It could be as big as Jakarta for one concession only. So looking into that kind of options on how to ensure that the old concession that is still intact forest can be saved and can be conserved into a more sustainable use will be one key to materialize sustainable landscape management in Indonesia. And the last point is on the 31.8 million hectares of non-forest in forest estate. There's a lot of options to do restorations of functions and production. And of course, some of this land can also be relinquished from the forest estate to be used for non-forestry uses, for agriculture, for infrastructures and other uses. But a big chunk of that number could also be used to be turning back into forest and restoring the forest functions into its original state. And so I think this is a summary of the menu of intervention that we can propose. And the good news is that KLHK already come up with a very comprehensive plan on the Indonesia net FOLU sink for 2030 that details out all of this different intervention. And I think given the time allocation that we have in this event right now, I'm just going to skip a lot of this slides and go right into this summary slide that KLHK already has. There's a link in this presentation that you can search it on Google as well on the Indonesia FOLU net sink in 2030 strategy. But basically it comes down to all this different menus. So we have we need to reduce the emission coming from deforestations and peatland degradations. The second is to increase the capacity from the natural forest to absorb the carbon. The third one is restoring the degraded peatland. The fourth one is on restoring the forest. But going down the menu list, we're starting to think, we're starting to see a more sustainable landscape management here. Starting from adopting sustainable forest management, looking into how we can optimize land use as well, increasing yield productivity of agriculture, and the last one is reducing the food loss and waste. If you can, we have a couple of statistics that shows that within our agricultural supply chain and value chain, there's actually a lot of significant number of loss happening along the lines due to inefficient mechanism, as well as opportunity to increase the yield for agriculture as well. So I think this operational plan for Indonesia FOLU net sink in 2030 is a good summary on what Indonesia is proposing to do and to implement to reach the net zero emission from FOLU sector in 2030, which I think is quite relevant as well for the G20 members to look into. I know that the time is very limited. It's 10 minutes. I almost use all of my time, so I'm going to give it back to Mas Alta so that we can discuss more in the discussion session. Back to you, Mas Aditya.
Thank you very much, Andika, for highlighting the sustainable options of landscape intervention in FOLU. Yeah. And next we have our second speaker from CIFOR and ICRAF, Professor Meine van Noordwijk. Good morning, Meine. So you have about 10 minutes for the presentation again. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. And And indeed, good morning from Wageningen, where I'm still happen to be. Saya pulang ke Indonesia besok. So thanks for asking me to present here. I added the name of Tom Tomic to this because we're jointly and together with CIPS at the moment doing some work on this sustainable landscape management for Indonesia, ideas how it could be done. So the organizers asked me two things: the key challenges for creating sustainable landscape management in Indonesia based on international policy experience, and approaches and strategies in sustainable landscape management that could be relevant in Indonesia. And of course, that is way too much for 10 minutes. But I was triggered by, are we moving the slides? Why is it not moving? Sorry. Sorry, it does not respond. Yeah, so Annika just showed this picture of that, let's say, a forest-based perspective on this intact forest, this fragmented forest, the degraded forest, the deforested land. And of course, from my background and in agroforestry, you wonder, hey, we actually also have agroforestry. And it's interesting to see that agroforestry is mentioned as part of the solutions for the deforested land. But actually, we do have a lot of it already. And the problem is it's not covered in statistics. It's still split between Ministry of Forestry and Ministry of Agriculture. And in neither of them, agroforestry is actually a priority place on that. So that's part of the challenge, I think, in moving to sustainable landscape management, that we first need to acknowledge that forestry agriculture is a continuum in reality. And we still need progress to treat it as a continuum in the policy frame. Probably specifically relevant for the current debate is the statistics that 15 to 20% of the oil palms grown in Indonesia grow inside the kawasan hutan, while there is no legal basis for that to exist. And one of the, where it is smallholder part, of course, agroforestry concessions is one of the potential ways to deal with that. Now, we start in this whole thing from, on one hand, the global perspectives, the global carbon footprint of humanity is way exceeds the capacity of the planet, and the result is what we see in the climate, in the increase of CO2 in the atmosphere and the carbon part. But in that part, there is basically there's 2 degrees of freedom on the supply side, that is either increase the area for productive purposes or increase productivity. And there are 3 things that determine the demand side, that is the population, the consumption per person, and the footprint per unit consumption. And the question is, where is the space to do better? Now, of course, we want people to develop, so and part of that is a likely increase of consumption per person. So the main part is in reducing the footprint of what we have, but especially in the bioproductivity, the idea that land is first segregated into agriculture and forestry misses out substantial opportunities, because the land equivalent ratio of mixed systems can be 20, 50, sometimes 80% higher than when land is used for either agriculture alone or forestry alone. So yeah, we do need to include that in our mental models. Now, of course, we then see that sustainable landscape management has an ecological axis, has a social axis, and in each of them, we need to move from what do we use to describe the world towards what do we need to understand how it works, to how do we diagnose problems, and how do we evaluate solutions on the scenario side. Now, in some effort that we do, we say that, of course, there's the whole alphabet worth of conceptual frames that either emphasize the ecological side of sustainable landscape management or the social side of it. And clearly, we need to move on the diagonal. We need to move from how we describe the world towards what can be done to nudge it in the right direction. And well, we don't need to go into any detail of any of the things, but the range of things go from the driver pressure analysis to 5 capitals to perspectives on values of nature, understanding the cycles, etc. Now, an important part of there's been substantial international progress on the agroecology side, which you think starts from the ecological side, but there have been a high-level panel on that under FAO flag that led to international support for 10 to 13 principles. If we take these principles, we can see that they actually range from things that are primarily emphasizing the ecological side about soil health and reducing external inputs and biodiversity, toward things that are primarily on the social side, the economic diversification, the food sovereignty, the fairness part. And together it leads in the end to land and resource governance that is needed to get this agroecological transformation. And I think that's an important part to think that most of it either come from a technical or a social perspective, and we really need both to achieve what we want. One step further is if we take these 13 agroecology principles in an SDG frame, then of course we see that, and most of them is somehow related to food, but at the same time, we're equally interested in health and in water and energy and jobs and economic growth, as well as on the climate change and the biodiversity side. So we do need that overall framework of SDGs to get further. At the same time, on the ground, we see in the landscapes, we need to move from problems, symptoms, from floods and and water pollution towards drought and fire and whatever, as symptoms of what happens and what drives local policy responses. Because below that is a structure of loss of buffering in the landscape, changes of a mosaic fine-grained with lots of buffering function towards a more segregated perspective. Then misuse leads to conflicts. And behind that, we need to look at the roles, the rules, and the drivers of change. And landscape management is about local problems being analyzed and addressed at the local scale within an overall supportive national framework. So that leads us to, we can look at sustainable landscapes at 4 levels: at the level of the data that exist, at the level of the feedbacks that we understand, at the level of the institutions that deal with the roles and rules, and at the level of the goals. And it is relevant to, of course, to see that if these 4 are not aligned, we won't make progress. We can start with the goals, but if we don't translate that into institutions, and in the end, if we don't have the data at a relevant scale to see whether we make progress, then we won't be there. So this is an attempt to put on one hand, we deal with the individual scale, the community scale, the subnational, the national, the global scales. We deal with data, with feedbacks, with institutions and goals. And of course, we have the SDGs out here. But in the end, what matters is the footprints at the individual scale, what responsibility people have and take for what they consume and where they live, etc. Now, in between, we can go for the individuals towards their goals, and we got the Maslow pyramid of goals. We can go from the footprints up to the targets and the SDG indicators in the data and operate at the global scale. But basically, we have a top-down route, you can say, that first goes from the individual to the data and then to the goals. There is a bottom-up perspective that first go from the individuals to their goals and then up. And at the same time, the sustainable landscape management is trying to strengthen some intermediate layer in the system. And it can only function in relation to individual responsibility and governance systems that allow something to happen at the bottom-up scale. So in summarizing the literature, that this is work with Tom Tomic, we think 5 points are important for Indonesia. That is, on one hand, that sustainable landscape is about multifunctionality. And so we have multiple goals, and the relevance of it is based on those multiple goals. We need to understand how data, feedbacks, institutions, and goals together form this issue cycle, and progress can be limited if people don't have the same understanding of what happens, if we don't have the same goals, if we don't agree on the common but differentiated responsibility, the means of implementation, and if we don't have a MRV system that is open to innovation. For example, if we keep recording land as either forest or agriculture, and we don't have a way to record anything in between, then we might miss opportunities to support what we want. Of course, it is the multiple scales, multiple stakeholders that make it complex, as Budami said. And at the same time, that's where the opportunity is. And we do need, this bottom-up part, the effective local voice and empowerment. Everything around that is relevant. At the same time, there is space for a national policy that supports that, not by imposing what sustainable landscape should be, not by making blueprints, not by planning in Jakarta what should happen in every desa of Indonesia, but for allowing this space for a bottom-up perspective to emerge and to articulate its role. And of course, Indonesia, we're very rich in a diversity of, from volcanoes to the mangroves and the sea in terms of the ecosystems. We're very rich in cultural diversity and language in many parts. The main challenge is that we have this sectoral structure that functions in Jakarta at the national level. And on the ground, we need to unpack all these different sectoral lines back to what it actually means for people to live in a landscape and to look at what is wrong, what can be done better, and to have initiatives on the ground that work in local context. I think that's, in a summary, my message. I'd be happy to discuss any part of this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maina, for sharing with us about the multiple spaces of governance for sustainable landscape management, and how the multiple spaces need to interact and to see land use as a continuum. Now, we are now going to open the question and answer session. Again, a reminder for all participants, if you have any questions or comments, you can put them into the chat box, or you can also use the raise hands feature, and I'll be sure to hand over the mic to you so you could speak directly. We have our first question from Julie. Oh, no. Okay, just a request to. All right, we're still waiting for the questions. Maybe for now, I have my own question that perhaps the two of you can help address. And since we are now talking in a T20 forum, which is a part of a global platform in the G20, what do you think are the specific topics and concerns that are related to sustainable landscape management that can be best addressed in a global forum like this? And what recommendations that would you advocate to global leaders in the G20? Maybe we can start with Pa Andika and then Maina.
Sure, thank you. I think every landscape issue is also a global issue. For example, the issue of land use in Indonesia is heavily influenced by the dynamics of commodity productions, Just recently, we've had a record-breaking, commodities as well as palm oil price, and with the Russia invasion to Ukraine, there's a short of supply from Ukraine sunflower to Europe, and then it suddenly creates a pressure for demand for palm oil from Indonesia, and it creates a lot of changes in how the landscape can be managed as well. There's a concern that with this increased demand and increased price, there's more appetite for the growers of commodities to expand. And of course, in order to meet the demand, the increasing demand and the increasing price, there's always an option to increase productivity, increase yield, and create a much more efficient production system in our landscape. But there's also always an attempt to took the shortcut and just expand, because that's I think for a lot of economic actors, that's easier and probably cheaper as well in some geographic area. And if you're talking about how it relates to G20 members, G20 is a very unique group that, you know, I think we can say that half of it is developed nations and half of it is also developing nations. We have Indonesia, we have Brazil as well, that has still a lot of natural resources, a nature-based solution that can be provided into the global community. And so it's a perfect forum to actually talk about how when Pak Maine mentioned about differentiated responsibilities, this is a very key issues in climate mitigation context. This is a perfect forum actually to talk about policy options for both the country that can provide the nature-based solution and also the country that can use the nature-based solution to reduce their footprint as well. So I guess we can explore all different topics in this conversation that requires us to extend this conversation into a 3-hour-long conversation. But I'm going to give the floor to Pak Maine as well, because I think he has a lot of wisdom to share with us as well.
Well, yeah, thank you. And I would say, I mean, yeah, what I understand, of course, that at the G20 level, a key issue is this subsidiarity, that to what extent is and should every country be able to sort out its own things, but address responsibility for global commons, whether they are the climate or the biodiversity or others. And first is well, so within that common but differentiated responsibility that has most often been discussed between countries, yeah, and our NDC, our nationally determined contribution, is a reflection of that. Of course, it also applies within countries, and there we now talk about IDCs next to the NDC, so the individually determined contributions versus the national determined contribution. And increasingly, and palm oil is one of the examples of that, individual consumers want to take their responsibility for what they are consuming or using and whatnot, because they see a link with production. And that leads to certification, that leads to demands, the current EU policies or the candidate policies on deforestation free, the companies declaring that they will be. At the same time, the challenge there is that, well, it reopens the debate on what is the definition of forest, what is deforestation free, what not, what is included, what is not, a huge can of worms and basically there is no dichotomy, there's no single definition that matches what everyone wants from that. And yes, throwing it back to the responsibility of countries, responsibilities of jurisdictional entities to make sure that they take care of their environment as well as their social part. So the problem is at the moment, it is the regulation is commodity by commodity. And yet a number of the important opportunities would be to, well, Indonesia has a problem with oil palm, a problem with cacao production not matching the current capacity to process. Systems that have both cacao and oil palm actually are very productive and profitable, but they don't exist because the policy frame separates these things completely. So we miss opportunities by segmenting the problem first and then looking for solution. And if we look for the solutions overall, there is a lot more space to do things. But the challenge is, and in the G20, and what can and should be regulated and agreed on between countries, and what can and should be decided at the individual level within that common but differentiated responsibility framework. And our countries facilitating the expression of IDCs, or are they fighting it? And are we supporting that? Yeah, individual level decisions can play a role. There should be transparency of how things are produced without leading to micromanagement from Brussels about what should happen in Indonesia, because the definitions of forest that come from outside. So that's, I think, the challenge to, if there is, yeah, and I think that the CBDR, the common but differentiated responsibility, is still a very useful framework to discuss it, but not only between countries, also within countries and at the individual level. Thanks.
Thank you, Mina. We have a question, okay, from Julie, who wants to ask it directly. Please go ahead.
Yes. Hello. Yeah, so I would like to ask about how we can support like agroecology, because you were talking about agroecology, and well, we're working in the T20 and the G20, and I noticed that on one hand, agroecology is like very local, very context specific, and really addresses like more smallholder farmers or just local markets. And then at the same time, I know we need a global support, because the farmers suffer from some market conditions. So there is a need for like the G20 to actually make subsidies or policies so we can support agroecology. So my question is, how, like, can you steer or think about this complexity of, on one hand, we have agroecology in a very local and context-specific way. So how can the G20 actually support agroecology while it's not really a universal science, or it's not very global science? So yeah, how do you find the link between the global scales and the local scale, basically? That's my question.
Thank you, Julian. I think that's for Mina to answer, yeah?
Okay, well, I think I'll pass it on to Annika later. But yeah, I mean, agroecology, I mean, there is, and that's generally this whole thing, there is a attraction of magical solutions, of silver bullets, and if we call it agroecology or we call it whatever is in fashion, as if that would by itself solve the problems. And of course, agroecology is not a prescriptive system. It is more, yeah, a set of principles, a set of ways of analyzing, thinking about it. The critique on it is, on one hand, and the same is for regenerative agriculture. People say, well, there's actually nothing new in it. Any good farmer would have known these things forever, but they would not be able to do it given the market pressures and others. So it is not, you can't certify that this is now agroecology versus not. It is more, yeah, like the CBDR, an expression of this is direction in which we want to go. And we need to analyze where are the bottlenecks, where are the perverse subsidies in the current system. Of course, I mean, coming from the agroforestry perspective, we've seen for a long time that, yeah, although agroforestry systems that have productive trees as well as other agriculture, well, the problem is if all timber is treated as if it comes from the forest, and you need a lot of permits to cut any tree, etc., etc. So 15 years ago, Indonesia deregulated a number of trees, including Sengon. If you now see in Java, that works very well. It is very attractive to have timber production on farm within agricultural landscapes and providing a good chunk of the local needs of that front. But that is still on the sort of sideline of government frameworks that are defined on the basis of forest on one hand and agriculture on the other. So yeah, agroecology is a motivation to look at these things jointly and to look at the interfaces. There actually is a ASEAN policy framework now that all ASEAN countries have subscribed to take these agroforestry options seriously within that frame. At the same time, we don't want to prescribe to anyone what to do and what agroforestry should look like. So it is like that CBDR, it is about taking responsibility and allowing responsibility to be expressed. And I think that is the challenge we need to work on together through, local problems can be solved locally, but many problems also have roots at the national scale or the global trade part. Sorry, I can't be specific, but I think that's the direction I think we coming from the international debate on these things.
Thank you, Mana. Offering the floor also to Pa Andika if you want to address that.
I'm sure maybe just a short commentary for me, and thank you for the questions, Julie. I think as a global platform, the T20 and the G20 is very relevant to scale up the solution that we have. And you are right that agroecology is very locally specific. It needs more granularity when it comes to science like agroecology. But a platform such as G20 and T20, the power of this kind of platform is eventually will trickle down to economic actors as well as the local government. We are seeing a trend from global companies, whether it's a consumer goods company or a grower or a trader company, they are starting to look beyond their supply chain. They want to look into their landscape production. Because they finally realize that even though they are managing their concession or their plantation very well, if their neighbor is not doing the same, they're not going to have the benefit of a good managed landscape. And so I think when there is a strong political signal coming from the countries of the biggest consumers of commodities, the G20 is the biggest commodities buyer in the world, actually. And hopefully this will trickle down to the private sector actors, and they started to look beyond their supply chain and invest more on locally suitable solutions such as the agroecology. I think we have more and more commitment coming from these companies with new buzzwords as well, like forest positive actions. NDP is the buzzword that I think we've heard a lot in the last 4 years. But it's quite exciting to see that kind of solution now becomes much more localized, and they understand that it needs to be localized. So I think that's the connection between the agroecology with this global platform.
Thank you. Now moving on to, we have our next question from Pramodito, directed at Pak Maina. This is a very practical question. How can we reduce the emission from the food agriculture sector? What do you think about that?
Well, of course, the first challenge in that is the different metrics. Let's say whether you look at it per unit land or per unit product. Yeah, and of course, to reduce emissions per unit land is often based on not maximizing productivity. If you look at it per unit product, then you get slightly different views. So last time we looked in detail at, let's say, the footprint of palm oil, and then what, of course, if we add more fertilizer to the system, we can increase production, but we also increase the greenhouse gas emissions. And when we optimize footprint in terms of, let's say, what is the lowest footprint per unit palm oil produced, then some intermediate level of intensity shows up to be the best. Yeah, so it is an analysis. There's no general answer. There's a analysis that need to be made for every specific production system. But yes, optimizing for footprints is not the same as trying to get the highest yield out of a unit of land. It's also not necessarily what current economics drive farmers to do. So there is a specific analysis needed to do it. At the same time, a challenge in those things is indeed when we have intercropping, when we have multiple products coming from the same unit of land, how do we attribute the emissions? Do we count it for the dominant economic commodity? Do we look at the totality, etc.? There is ideas on how to do that for footprint calculation, but they are not without problems in their own right. So yes, it is about maintaining in the long term soil organic matter levels, productivity of the land, not compromising on that. But be careful with external input use, because they do produce N2O emissions that count together in the carbon footprint. So there's no standard recipe, but for example, in rice, there has been a lot of opportunity in modifying the water management to reduce N2O emissions and reduce the footprint per unit rice coming out of it. But it needs analysis in every specific regional context. Unfortunately, our Indonesian universities are barely scratching the surface on those things yet, and there is a lot more that could be done locally with more local expertise if that would be developed at the university level in every part of Indonesia.
Thank you, Mina. Now, we have another one from Gabriela, highlighting about the private sector's role and how can we confront the trade-off, considering that the main goal of the private sector players are profit and growth. Yeah, so how can we encourage or perhaps incentivize the private sector? I will address the question to both speakers, maybe starting with Pa Andika first.
Sure, Adit. It's a very interesting question that I deal basically every day, because this is also within my portfolio. But what is interesting is throughout the years, I think I've personally felt that it is easier and easier to talk to private sectors. I think 10 years ago, when I first started talking to these private sectors and convincing them to change their business model into a much more sustainable ones, committing to no deforestation policy, it's pretty hard. But now I think they are starting to realize that sustainability is no longer a demand from a mere NGOs. It is a means to survive in this new business world. Sustainability has become a survival tools for them. And I think this also relates to what Pak Main mentioned before. There is also an individual footprint. The consumers also demands for that. Now the market is heading towards that direction as well. I think in anecdotal cases, and for Indonesia case, for example, sustainable palm oil, a lot of the demand is coming from European countries, the United States. Singapore and Malaysia also have quite a strong demand for sustainable palm oil. Unfortunately, from our domestic consumption, there is not much of demand for sustainable palm oil. I can only count one consumer products on the shelf of supermarkets in Indonesia that has a certified sustainable palm oil logo in it. It shows that Indonesia is the biggest producer of certified sustainable palm oil, actually has no or not yet identified market for that. So there's a lot of work to be done in the realm of the demand intervention. I think a lot of the NGOs and the think tanks are working quite hard on the supply side of the sustainable commodity, but not so much on the demand. Indonesia is the biggest CPO market, China as well, India as well. Both China, India, and Indonesia does not have a strong demand on certified sustainable palm oil. So I would totally agree with Pak Main that emphasizing that individual footprint, individual determined contribution could also lead to a much better conducive environment if we want to move forward into the sustainable landscape management future.
Yeah, same question to Mina.
Yeah, it may be boring because we seem to agree on almost everything. But yeah, I mean, talking on the palm oil side, of course, yeah, the market gets very much segmented. There is Europe, North America, in which this demand for sustainability certification is increasing. Yet, what is it? 40% of Indonesian palm oil would go to India and China and markets that don't require that, and the domestic market doesn't require that. So, in the global sense, small changes in India and China shifting in that direction is probably more important than having a stricter version of the rules for existing part. So certification always has this aspect of shifting the blame. I keep my hands clean because I use clean products, but same time the other stuff is still sold to somebody else, and I wash my hands from that. So clearly, certification segmentation is not the solution. It can be part of a direction of change, but until the whole, the 80% of the market demand is for sustainable, but only then have you actually created the driving force to move on that front. At the same time, there is the challenge with all the global certification systems is that they are pretty coarse, and they the opportunity for more local, regional certification, regional identity, saying, well, if the products come from Kerinci, if they come from this kabupaten, that kabupaten, then the kabupaten its name is at stake, and we guarantee that across the commodities, our landscape is securing the environment as well as providing social benefits to the people. That is the alternative for commodity by commodity certification as we now see. And I would still think that the regional taking responsibility pathway still seems a promising one, and to complement the global certification standards, because they do have a number of serious problems associated with them. Thanks.
Thank you, Maina. Next, we have a question from our own Felipa Amanta. This one is for Pa Andika. Can you share some assessment about the implementation of Indonesia's Polunet Sink 2030? And to what extent have the strategies in that operational plan been reflected in development plans in Indonesia or RPJMN? And also, maybe how do you see it being positioned with contradictory programs like the food estate?
Felipa loves to ask hard question, and this is one of them, I think. So I think Felipa, for the operational plan for the Polunet Sink in 2030 is quite recent. They published it on the website in February 2022. So I haven't had the time to really go through all the pages, but looking into the summary, the executive brief, as well as going through the document in brief, I would say that it has a very comprehensive set of solutions already put into that document. But then the question is, how operable is that in the 8 years of time frame that we have to complete that plan? And to answer that, I think the complexity of Indonesia democracy architectures, when you have to deal with local government's authority, when some of these concessions are under the authority of the local bupatis and the local governors, it makes it even harder, even if the central government already have a good plan to reduce deforestation and to shift land use into a much more optimal state. Moreover, I think what is going to be needed in this process is to have alignment between the interests of the national government as well as with the local government. And I'm speaking on this from I think our own experience dealing with local government. When you look into the land use of a province and say, you know, this X number of hectares of timber and logging concession, as well as X number of hectares of palm oil concession can be revoked, the first question that we'll ask is that we will lose a significant amount of revenue from our provincial state budget. And so that's a very practical question that a plan such as this needs to answer in a very tangible term, and not just some sort of conceptual answer into this. So I think that is going to be the most challenging part of materializing this net Polu Sink plan in 2030. But I think looking into the the plan, it has enough beef of numbers and thoughts put into that, that it might be 2 to 3 steps away from being able to be implemented in the robust, in a tangible way nationally. And if we want to look into the seemingly contradictory programs like the food estate, the biggest issue is transparency. The government claims that the food estate has, taken into account the environmental concerns, have taken into account the local rights concerns as well. But what is not being revealed is the data, the granular data that puts into that they take into account into this planning. And so I think it is too early to judge that whether the food estate is going to end up costing us X millions of hectares. But it would be much better if the government provides more transparency into this process, and so that it is open for third-party reviewers, NGOs, academics, think tanks to look into this issue with their own lens and provide their own independent analysis. I think that would be my short answer to the hard questions that Felipe asked. Over to you, Mas Adit.
Sorry, I can't unmute myself. In view of the time, yeah, I think I will have one last question from the queue and have both our speakers, Pa Andika and also Maine, to answer. And maybe also think of this as a closing statement for this meeting. Yeah. We have the question from Dulce Punzalan regarding the UN Food Systems Summit action. I think it's the 5 action tracks of the UN Food Systems Summit. Yeah, which one of these do you think is the most challenging in terms of actual implementation, and why? And perhaps if I can also add to that, maybe if you can explain to what extent is sustainable landscape management compatible with the UN Food Systems Summit agenda. Yeah, maybe we can start with Maine.
Yeah, thank you. Well, we kept the hardest question to the end. Of course, I mean, the main problem with these things that among those 5, you need all of them before it actually works. Yeah, and I don't think the answer to that would be the same if you think about different parts of Indonesia. Yeah, there are parts of Indonesia where there's little economic opportunity outside primary commodity production. There's parts of Indonesia where there is flexibility in other jobs and other relevance of land use. So so in terms of the equitable livelihoods, decent work, empowered communities, that I mean, most of the green growth strategies that we've seen have still an element of going a bit more downstream, not only producing the primary commodity and selling it and have all the value addition elsewhere, but getting more local processing, getting more of the value chain stay within the area. Well, that's possible for some commodities, not for others. Indonesia made a big move on that in cacao, and from being the 3rd producer of cacao, it now is sort of the 3rd one in terms of processed cacao, but it has to import a lot of cacao beans from Ecuador and other countries because the production collapsed in the meantime. So there are real challenges on that pathway of going to the more downstream part if it isn't aligned with sustainable production. So I'm afraid I have to dodge the issue. I mean, all 5 are important. The risk part, the vulnerability is clearly there. The social equity is a challenge, and maybe, and that is back to what also Andika challenged, that the transparency, the lack of metrics that are in public discussion about what these things are, is probably one of the main constraints. I've just been in the Netherlands for a couple of weeks, but in many issues here, there is more transparency and more public debate on the nitty-gritty parts of things than often we see in Indonesia, because it's still largely based on arm waving and general expressions of intent and not based on real data being open and accessible on that. So overall, the transparency part to make these debates more public and more informed, I think that's probably the one underlying all of these things. So until that we have all these 5 things reflected in metrics and in data that are for public debate, it will remain large in emotional debate where people have positions that are predefined and are not contributing to actual problem solving. Over to Andika.
Nope. I mean, I think that's a very good, a good closing statement. I mean, transparency is key when you're talking about, land use and landscape management. There's a lot of things that can make the situations a lot more murkier than it is. And one of them is the data, the terminology that is being used, the political charge of the issue usually revolves around those 2 things. So I think if we can advocate for more accountability and transparency on the data, I believe it's a science. We can thrive in the science-based policymaking for land use if we have the openness and the accountability of the decision-making process.
Thank you. Now that we are reaching the end of our event today, it has been very enriching to learn about the challenges, the trade-offs and approaches and land uses, and maybe also very relevant to G20's big theme of economic recovery, which should also include the landscape approach and an agenda to significantly transform the food and land use systems, for positive outcomes for the people and the planet and prosperity. And hopefully this won't be the end of our interactions with the topic. And we can really push the messages from this meeting into tangible agenda and commitments at the global and national levels. One more thing before we close, as a part of side events of T20 Indonesia, which is the official G20 engagement group, we need all audiences' feedback for our evaluation by filling out a side event survey at the link provided in the chat box. So again, lastly, thank you to WRI Indonesia and the Food and Land Use Coalition for supporting this event. Also to Professor Damayanti for setting the stage with the opening remark. And of course, we thank our wonderful speakers, Pa Andika and Dr. Maine, for the wonderful presentations and answers. And thank you to all audience for joining and taking part with your questions and comments.